Good morning, everyone. This is Servium calling. My name is Steve Dawes, and I'm the Services Director here at Servium. Welcome to episode 3, season 4 of our INOOT webinar series. Thanks very much for taking the time to join. INOOT focuses on the technologies, trends to look out for the marketplace, new disruptive, innovative technology, leading vendors that we believe address the business challenges that you're facing. But today's a little bit different because we're not joined by any vendors. The theme for today is tackling infrastructure lifecycle management. So we're going to examine some commonplace scenarios that confront you and your infrastructure based on something we call a scenario analysis. So we're going to take a bit of a dive into the economics and complexities of the infrastructure with view to challenging the assumptions that you may make. So to deliver that for us today, I'm glad to be joined by Dean Flynn, who's our solutions architect. Good morning, Dean.
Good morning, Steve.
So, Friday the 13th, I'm not superstitious at all, but what's happened on this day, Friday the 13th? Well, most interesting fact I got was 1995, GoldenEye, the 17th James Bond film starring Pierce Brosnan. For the first time, along with Judi Dench, Shazam was released. So that was the 13th of November. But today's all about INOOT. And as usual, we're using Zoom to deliver the webinar today. There will be a recording. As usual, at the end, we'll take a poll and we'll discuss the call to action with Dean towards the end. There's the opportunity to ask questions anonymously as well. All the recordings go onto our YouTube channel, and there'll be a prize draw right at the end when we've finished. So, Servium is all about creating great experiences for you, our customers, helping you with your essential IT, the business challenge you face. We're the troubleshooter. We walk in your shoes, and again, today demonstrates that and what the purpose of today is all about. And our whole approach is around the life cycle of a challenge, no matter how large, no matter how small, working with you throughout. And we'll talk a lot about that today, or Dean will, about how we will address the particular challenges we're facing around infrastructure life cycle. And to help deliver a lot of these solutions, we have a tremendous breadth and depth of services ecosystem that you have access to as our customers. So we're very transparent about how we engage with you as our customers. We're not unique in the industry when we say we do partner where we need specific subject matter expertise, but we're absolutely transparent on who we use and why we're using them. So when we look at our Servium Pathfinder, there's different segments to this, and really this we're focused on a lot of this today. So Dean will cover that off in the session. So that's sort of setting the scene. I'll now hand over to Dean, who's going to delve deeper into talking about lifecycle management. Over to you, Dean.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Steve, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this morning. Just want to spend a little bit of time talking about myself. That's not an ego thing. I think it serves the purpose of setting the scene around the approach that we're talking about, some of my experience and how I came to sort of develop the methodology that we're going to be walking through today. So I put up here software-defined sales experience. I'm not presently a pure seller, but certainly at the beginning of my career, I spent some time with what's called the strategic team at Insight, the enterprise team at PCware, CompareX, Software One, looking after enterprise accounts, name drop here, but Volkswagen Group, SunGard, Ticketmaster, Aviva, and others. I've seen some very bad lifecycle management and acquisition practices in the enterprise, believe me. A technical SAM consultant, so I actually owned and operated, was a director of a pure SAM and IT and asset management consultancy company over in Germany for a good while. I can tell you now, as with the enterprise organizations that I've mentioned, German efficiency is something of a myth. And I've spent time also as a technical pre-sales manager, so taking a step back from acquisition and thinking of lifecycle management necessarily. I've been an overlay to sales teams, advising customers on technologies throughout various parts of infrastructure. So very much coming at things from a pre-sales technical standpoint. So why am I telling you this? Essentially, I need you to understand and appreciate that I'm coming at this from a position of being informed around commercials, yes, as a seller. I'm coming at this from the position of understanding IT and asset management, and I'll get into that in a few slides' time, but also that I have a good grounding and understanding of technology and how it all fits together. But enough about me. Bear with me a second. Okay, so what we're talking about today, I term a scenario analysis. Now, that's not unique to our industry. That's not something I necessarily invented in terms of the phraseology, but it came to be the naming of what we're talking about today. So I put up here, what is the strategic problem? And this is something of a contents page for us, just to explain, but what is the strategic problem? This actually comes from a book I read a very long time ago called Playing to Win, which is from a couple of Harvard Business School graduates who spent some time in the leadership team at Procter & Gamble during the low point of their existence. But under their stewardship, Procter & Gamble went, I think the statistic is that they doubled sales through the 2000s and into the 2010s. And they have a methodology based on a strategy cascade. So it's all about the systems and processes that need to be in place in order to execute against a particular problem. But the idea is we start with a problem and then we make sure that all of the systems and processes are in place to actually achieve a given aim. But that methodology is based on choice. So what are the available choices? And then we come up with reasons to eliminate particular choices. And then we can have some confidence around the decision that we do make, that it's right for our organization, that it's not going to come back to bite us further down the line. And we're going to get into that in a second. Okay, so what influenced the methodology? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the practices that I've seen and the issues that I've found with them. We'll dip into the scenario analysis itself and talk a little bit about what we look to achieve in the context of infrastructure and technology. And then I'm going to give you an example. Now, the example, it's quite difficult in this time period, the length of time that we have, and without specifically having access to your organizations to give examples that are fit for everybody. But what I'm looking to do is give you an example that gives you food for thought. And the idea is that we have a conversation further down the line, look at examples of where we might be able to apply this methodology to your organization, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so what is the strategic problem? So let's run through this very quickly. So the way I see there as being a problem with lifecycle management within a lot of organizations is this idea of short-termism. Too many of us spend too much time fighting fires and thinking in a short-termist way. And that's not to say that there's anything intrinsically wrong with any of us. I just think as human beings, we have a tendency to firefight and deal with what's in front of us. So a big problem that I see is decisions being made in a vacuum, as with the second point here, and that does create problems further down the line. The example that I've written down in my notes is that my sister and her partner bought a one-bedroom flat around 12 months before my nephew's arrival. And they still shudder if I mention early repayment charges or stamp duty, because they didn't spend a very long time in that apartment. Let's put it that way. On the flip side of that, I presently drive a two-seater car. that has 11 months remaining on its lease, and so I can't think about procreating for at least a few more months. The car has defined my life cycle, or at least my intentions. So a couple of examples there. Okay, so impact on flexibility, cost and agility, that's a huge issue. So decisions being made at a point in time without consideration for other factors, and vendor sprawl and duplication. We see this a lot, and I see this a lot in engagement with customers. You don't want to make decisions that preclude you from making good future ones. Capital acquisition of static assets versus flexible consumption of services. There's all different ways of acquiring IT assets, and you shouldn't make decisions independent of exterior metrics that might influence acquisition, sizing of infrastructure. You want to end up with the right decision. But this philosophy is all around choice, and we'll get into that in a second. Okay, so I mentioned that I'm coming at this from a software-defined angle. So I spent a lot of time as a licensing specialist for the organizations that I mentioned. And early on in my career, I came across something called the T-36 model. Now, this is a framework that Microsoft invented that is designed specifically to advise LSPs, or LARs as they were called at the time, around how to engage customers over the 36-month term of an enterprise agreement. Now, I'm not going to sort of labor the point with this. I just want to give you a feel for sort of the first time I encountered something that looked like strategic selling. Now, we just look at the second 2 years of this agreement. Now, don't need you to squint, don't need you to understand this too much, but if you've got any experience of Microsoft, it probably won't surprise you to hear that my interpretation of this model, I felt it served the vendor more than it served the customer. It siloed Microsoft technologies, so it was Microsoft-centric and selfish, and it failed to take into account wider strategy and exterior factors. It very much looked at licensing in a Microsoft bubble. But it did heavily encourage deployment and adoption of acquired technologies. So you'll see in here, there's all sorts of reference to deployment updates, engaging on things like software asset management, which is all to do with utilization and entitlement. So install base versus utilization is huge, and we'll I'm sure touch on that later. But in my head, this was good, but wasn't quite there. It sowed the seed of what was to come. Okay, so moving into the next phase of my career and the other major influence on the scenario analysis strategy. So ISO 19770 is in the ITAM best practice family. It'll be obvious why I'm mentioning this on this INOOT, but the objectives of ISO 19770 were management of the risk of interrupted IT service delivery, breach of legal agreements and audit, which was huge when you're a software asset management consultancy, number one. Reducing overall costs through the implementation of various processes, better information availability leading to improved decision making based on accurate data. Now, at the time, that was absolutely magic. And if we take a trip here, I used to go into organizations and actually independently review their processes, their acquisition methods, the people, tools and processes related to IT infrastructure and the management of infrastructure and software throughout the life cycle of those technologies. So my time in Germany was not at a reseller. We purely were consulting on acquisition and lifecycle management. So we would independently review organizations. And what I've done here is show you a visualization of something called the Microsoft SAM optimization model. If I were to show you a slide on the metrics that are measured under the ISO, it's pages and pages and pages. There's dozens of criteria, and it's far too complex and messy a slide. But the idea is that in various areas of practice, you can be rated either on the left-hand side under basic right the way up to dynamic. So if you're familiar with these with ISOs, this is a swim lane diagram, and effectively what we're looking to do with an engagement is identify red, amber, green opportunities for improvement, but essentially cyclical ITAM engagement services, but crucially not involved in the acquisition of the technologies, purely consulting on the technologies and helping customers refine the process. But, and it was a big but. So contrary to what the ISO itself advised in its early days, it's had a few iterations and versions since it was initially released. We were finding as an organization that we had this occur where we would engage, and the vast majority of the return on investment in services was realized in the opening consultancy, or certainly within the first few years of engagement. So we had huge return on investment as we identified things such as inefficiency in strategic planning, project pipeline, or contracts and methods of acquisition, how we thought about infrastructure. But then as you travel along the x-axis here, what we were finding is customers were getting less benefit for the increase in investment in ITAM. Now, that's a problem for a pure ITAM consultancy company, because what tends to happen, or what tended to happen, is we would engage at points of change in infrastructure, or sort of waypoints such as a software vendor audit, and that for us meant that we were quite often pressured from a time perspective. But the positive of that is that the ROI was huge. We'd engage on an audit, we'd fix some things, and we would do some really good work and get some really good feedback. But from there, our business model relied on managed services. And if as a customer you're getting the bulk of your ROI following that initial engagement, there's less of an incentive to continue to engage with an organization. So that was our finding, that there was a fundamental flaw in our business plan. We were a consultancy company and not the reseller. We were recommending technologies, but not selling them. So that brings us to today and the scenario analysis. So we found that those point in time assessments, workshops, audit response, times of infrastructure change were where the most impact was happening. But at a solutions provider such as Servium, you've kind of got the best of both worlds. So we pull things together, so that the T-36 methodology of consultancy, where you continue to engage an organization throughout infrastructure lifecycle. And if we pull in this idea that the biggest ROI is achieved at these impactful moments, so points of investment, audits, these kinds of things. Renewals are another huge one. You can probably see where I'm going if you're following the thread. The idea of a scenario analysis is that it's the entry point for these sorts of services. So Steve mentioned the Pathfinder a little bit earlier. What the scenario analysis is effectively is the review, strategy, and design phases of this Pathfinder. You cannot or should not make any significant infrastructure purchase in a vacuum. You need to understand what you presently have, so your entitlements, where they are in their life cycle. You need to understand the market, what exists in terms of technologies, and then come up with a strategy and go through the design phase to make sure that you're not missing a trick, or that you're not inadvertently encouraging maintenance of a status quo, or you're not taking advantage of the opportunities that are out there through strategic investment in IT. Okay, so very wordy slide, and you'll be pleased to know we are not spending very much time on this at all. But the scenario that I'd like to walk through today is it won't be the same as one that you might be thinking of in your head related to your organization, but it will stand as an example. Okay, so 3,000 reinsurance company, 3,000 user reinsurance company experiencing rapid organic growth. I'm going to skip past this effectively, but what you need to understand is that there's a license requirement here. So the reason for the initial engagement presented to the Servium team was as being a second set of eyes regards to a license purchase requirement. So an incumbent solutions provider has positioned a UK EA for approximately 6 months' time. Couple of points here. Data center licensing historically purchased alongside server hardware out of the UK office. There is a US office. The organization is heavily virtualized using VMware. Crucially here, the border, this cloud-first strategy that often comes down from the top without regard for the practicalities or costs involved, but the board wants to use Azure where possible, but have some concerns around ongoing costs following a small-scale trial where a Citrix-based remote working solution at Azure proved more expensive than anticipated. This particular organization has no plans to migrate to Office 365 due to concerns around cost and the effort required to migrate. This fictional organization was audited in 2017. It was painful, the shortfall, and therefore the money required to rectify that shortfall was higher than budgeted. So typical reseller response to this might be to present a customer with choices. So I'm not here to rag on any reseller practice. It's more introducing a different way of thinking about things. So typical response might be to position an MPSA, which if you have a familiarity with Microsoft agreements, you can purchase with software assurance. So effectively have more of an OpEx type approach to your licensing. But typically speaking, an MPSA results in spiky purchasing. So capital expenditure on licensing, a sweating of that asset, and then a repurchase of licensing as and when you have a requirement to move up to a newer version, for instance. You've then got pure OpEx in the form of an EAS, and an enterprise agreement is kind of a mix between the two. So there's a realization of a saving after an initial period. So just quickly, the EA in this example is more expensive in the first 3 years, and then the point at which this return on investment is around year 5 to year 6. But this is a typical response from a reseller. A better one, and I'm a stickler for this, if we look back at historical vendor pricing uplifts, Microsoft uplift by approximately 4% year on year if you look back over the last 20 years or so. So we like to see this, actually. It's a little bit more accurate. But then occasionally you might get a few scenario-based presentations to you. So practically speaking, what happens if we skip a version of a particular piece of software? There's all sorts of perfectly viable reasons why you might skip a version. And in this scenario, if you look at the cumulative spend graph for an MPSA, you'll see that actually skipping a version might be right for this organization if there's a good reason why they should stick rather than maintain software assurance. Okay, so if we look here, this is just a slight variation on the previous slide, but one of the pieces of information we received as part of that initial scenario setting was that this was a US company, or this company had a US presence. So transacting out of the US, taking advantage of the geographies and the fact that the Microsoft base price list is US dollar. There's an approximate, I believe it's around 17% saving in this scenario versus the the UK-based previous scenario. So that's a typical response, and here we are comparing in pounds a UK EA versus a US EA. So this is probably something, if you're involved in procurement or you're a budget holding IT decision maker, this might look a little bit similar to something you've seen before. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with it, but there's a few flaws in this that I'd just like to point out. Are you bored? Yes, in all likelihood. I've just shown you 3-4 different slides looking at scenarios and ways of looking at Microsoft licensing. And I'm not showing you that slide again, but what I'd look to do, what I want to do here is show you how I've interpreted this data or this initial conversation, and I'm looking to try to flip that into something that looks like what we call the scenario analysis. So I've taken the important information out of here. So the organization is a level B enterprise corporate. They value flexibility. So if you were quick and digested some of that slide, there was mention of a possible contraction of headcount due to exterior factors. I've correctly identified that the incumbent has positioned the UK EA despite physical presence in the US. And this is the big one. The incumbent has positioned the UK EA despite lack of clarity around application lifecycle and project roadmap. So it doesn't appear to have been any engagement on what the customer might like to deploy, or there was mention of a desire to adopt public cloud and a desire to look at Office 365, but there may be being some blockers to do so. Purchasing process and lifecycle management bears hallmarks of uncompliance and over licensing. There's almost definite compliance issue due to the lack of global deployment rights. So purchasing out of the UK for a US entity, whether it's VMware, Microsoft, several other vendors, there are often restrictions around where you can deploy that software, and hidden within that scenario as it was set was actually a potential hurdle regards compliance. Important point that was in there, and this will start to get the cogs whirring regards the scenario analysis. Lifecycle management indicates significant server infrastructure due for refresh or warranty extension in the near future. So there was that point around server licensing being purchased alongside the hardware. I would want to understand where that server infrastructure and why the data center infrastructure was as part of its life cycle, because there are significant impacts on licensing. Microsoft, VMware, backup solutions, security. What you don't want to do is commit yourself to a 3-year agreement without properly understanding holistically what this looks like. The organization is cloud curious and has stalled. So my recommendation would be to stop, to not spend a thing. This particular customer wasn't in an agreement cycle at this present time, and there was no pressing need to enter into one. So if you can possibly stall. I would recommend that we begin to do that review piece of that Pathfinder document. I want to understand the entitlement from a Microsoft licensing and VMware perspective. I'd really like to understand the utilization of the current on-premise data center environment. So a VOA, a VMware optimization assessment, some sort of assessment of the utilization of the infrastructure. I've lost count of the number of times where infrastructure has been massively overspec'd. Utilization has peaked around 50–60% and really isn't fit for purpose. A TCO analysis around on-premise Exchange, SharePoint, Skype for Business Cloud. This is where we're looking at project roadmap, what we might do over the next 3-year term of the agreement, or if you as an organization look at 5 years, 6 years, or sometimes less. We need to start to match project spend and investment and overall IT budget to these sorts of things. A discussion to take place around server refresh with focusing on right-sizing the VM density. Recommendation to conduct a cloud readiness assessment to help inform strategy. So why would you commit to 3 years of licensing? Why would you purchase an entirely new server environment if there's a desire from within the business to move at least some application to public cloud. So getting an understanding for what might be suitable for migration or for re-platforming, re-engineering, really, really important. A security posture review. Now, what I'm not about to recommend is that everything moves up into the cloud, lift and shift, and that we don't incorporate security into that conversation. So in bold for a reason here and made slightly bigger, there clearly needs to be a wider discussion around project pipeline, pain points, application and infrastructure, lifecycle management, training as well. Training needs to form an intrinsic part of lifecycle management. If you are moving to new versions of software, if you're purchasing new hardware, if you're transitioning to cloud, the skill set within your teams needs to keep up and needs to be planned out as part of that planning phase. So conscious of time, but possible outcomes of pausing might be that you move to an agreement type that is commercially more flexible or cost efficient for you. There's a mitigation of risk potentially because you've identified areas where there might be under licensing or over licensing, where you're overspending on software or overspending on hardware. As mentioned, the whole over provisioning piece, and that includes the virtual environment, allocating vCPU and VRAM where it's not necessarily needed. Reduction in CPUs results in a reduction in Windows Server license cost, backup software cost, and a reduction in power and cooling. There's a potential scenario where you might close a data center. In the scenario, there were a few data centers that don't necessarily need to be part of the picture moving forward, or there may be a scenario where you can downsize slightly. Accelerated cloud adoption with cost control, simplified, more integrated IT, less firefighting and human/time cost, often underrated, but if you could give your team back even 20-30% of their time, you could get on the front foot. Bigger discounts due to better planning. This is the commercial side of me. This is the seller in me. If I learn about an infrastructure spend early enough, you can often create scenarios where vendors are in a competitive situation and we're doing the right thing for your organization, but by ensuring that you've got the correct commercials and that you're, again, not missing a trick on that front. So ultimate result being that you have more stable, predictable spend, particularly at a time where we're seeing certain organizations have freezes on budgets, or they're being asked to sweat assets and find ROI. Predictability and assuredness, having a plan of action is more important than ever. Okay, so when to engage. So I mentioned review, strategy, and design, but what I want you to think about as we wind up today is the innermost colored circle of this wheel. So any period where you are thinking of investing in compute, data, networking, security, workspace, any period where you're looking potentially to make a significant infrastructure change, potentially moving data centers, moving to cloud, or when you've got a software renewal coming up, or you're facing a decision around warranty extension on data center hardware. It's a really good idea to engage, because as mentioned, the significant ROI, the cost saving, getting a handle on things by having more of an umbrella view. We'd love to use some of our expertise to pass some of that back to you, with the idea being that we engage as a trusted partner. We're more integrated with your decision-making process, whether you're purchasing or an IT decision maker. Ultimately, we want your cost to come down. We want you to see us as involved in that process, so that you come back to us and that this becomes a cyclical, symbiotic relationship. Okay. So appreciate that was a lot to get through.
I know, but there is quite a lot there, Dean. I think ultimately that our objective is to look at customers' costs, reduce their costs. Who is not looking at costs? No matter which market sector you work in the current environment, everyone's wanting to reduce their costs. So I think the key message there is that when you engage us, the earlier you do, and the more we find out about your environment, your infrastructure, your strategy, and so on, the more likely you are to save your money, which I think is really important. We all like to save the pennies. Okay, so I'll open the floor now for some questions, and put Dean on the spot a little bit. I always like to do that with the subject matter expert on the spot. So, Dean, a couple of questions coming in, just following on from the presentation. One from Alan about license compliance. Has that become a thing of the past because of the subscription models that the vendors are pushing?
In a way, certain elements of looking after subscription licensing get easier from a SAM perspective, because the software doesn't work if you haven't paid for it, essentially. However, what we see a lot of in the subscription and SaaS space is that organizations are over licensed, or they've got the wrong product for the wrong individual, or for the right individual, but looking at usage metrics. So is this particular user using Teams, for instance? Is there a necessity to conduct some training, upskill certain staff, so that we're reducing that time to value when we invest in a technology? So the shift has probably focused more toward how do I get the most out of the technology that I've invested in? Do I have a training issue? Do I need to maybe shift SKUs, maybe look at another product offering that is less expensive, but delivers on this particular type of user, if it's end user licensing? But yeah, the conversation shifted from one of compliance necessarily. It's more difficult to be uncompliant, more to one where you don't want to overspend and you need to keep on top of costs.
Okay, thanks, Dean. Question from me in relation to something you mentioned in the presentation about cloud first. So what's your sort of opinion on particular services workloads maybe to move to the cloud, if you are looking to start to adopt a cloud first strategy?
It's a good question, and cloud is something that we could do hours on, although not one for today, but very, very quickly. There's all sorts of white papers that have been written around cloud migration and strategy. There's something we have access to called a cloud readiness assessment, where we look at the application. We look at an application, its dependencies, whether that's other applications or storage volumes, and we look at its suitability for transfer to cloud. So that encompasses where you are in your data center lifecycle, security, backup lifecycle. You don't want to move an application and its dependencies to cloud for the sake of it. It's got to make sense from a commercial standpoint, and it's got to make sense from a technology standpoint. All sorts of questions around, can we re-platform this application? Can we take a new SaaS application that's potentially better suited to us as an organization? My advice would be, if you're dipping your toes in the water regards cloud, choose something non-contentious that is an island and isn't going to break your business. It's not business critical. If you're further along your journey, then you need to be a little bit more strategic around where and how you execute against that strategy to migrate. And it all starts with understanding where you are at the moment and what exactly is involved in getting there, whether it's right ultimately, because some applications are destined to remain on premise for a long time, and with good reason. Okay,
that's good. Thanks for that, Dean. If you do have any further questions, then obviously drop an email to either the account manager or to INOOT@servium.com, and we'll answer those for you. So thanks, Dean. I know we had limited time. It is quite an in-depth topic. I think the call to action really for everyone today is, if you are interested in having a review around your hardware, your infrastructure, your software, your cloud journey, and so on, then we'll engage with Dean and set up a one-to-one. But if you'd like to do that, that's in the poll. So I'm going to launch the poll now. Again, We take your feedback seriously. It's important that we fine-tune our webinars, with not only the content speakers, but also make sure it's relevant to you. So feedback is important. So if you wouldn't mind completing the poll, also in there, if you would like to engage Servium in an infrastructure lifecycle review, then you can highlight that in the poll as well.